This is the moment many people didn't expect to see connected to a former Disney Channel name. Not a headline about a new role, but a quiet, complicated legal situation that unfolded behind closed doors. According to publicly available reports, what happened on Christmas Eve wasn't about fame, cameras, or spectacle. It was about compliance, prior court conditions, and a series of decisions that led authorities to step in. And the most surprising part isn't just that it happened. It's how long this story had been building before anyone outside the situation noticed. To understand how this situation reached that point, it's important to step away from headlines and look at the broader timeline, carefully, responsibly, and based only on confirmed information. Matt Prokop became publicly known at a young age through family-friendly entertainment, where his image was tied to light-hearted roles and a carefully managed public presence. Like many former child actors, his transition into adulthood happened largely outside the spotlight, with less media attention and fewer public updates about his life. Years later, according to law enforcement records cited by multiple outlets, Prokop became involved in a separate legal matter that resulted in court-ordered bond conditions. While the full details of that earlier case were not widely disclosed, what is clear from public documentation is that those conditions were legally binding and required strict compliance. That context matters, because the events that followed were not described by authorities as a spontaneous incident, but as a response to an alleged violation of those existing conditions. On December 24th, officers were reportedly dispatched to an apartment in Victoria, Texas. The visit itself was not unusual in a procedural sense. Law enforcement agencies routinely follow up when a court order may have been breached. What made this situation escalate, according to an incident report later, obtained by media outlets, was the interaction that followed. Police state that when officers identified themselves and explained the reason for the arrest, cooperation did not immediately occur. According to the report, the door was closed abruptly, and officers then worked to gain entry in order to carry out the arrest. It's important to be precise here. No official statements describe excessive force, dramatic confrontation, or anything beyond what officers characterized as resistance to standard procedures. The language used in reports focuses on noncompliance, pulling away, refusing instructions, rather than violence or harm. Eventually, according to those same records, Prokop was restrained and transported to a local county facility where he was formally booked. The charges listed at that time included alleged evasion of arrest and violation of bond conditions. Administrative but serious matters within the legal system, but that was not the end of the situation. As part of the booking process, additional allegations were documented. These included claims related to invasive recording without consent and possession of illegal visual material involving minors, allegations that law enforcement agencies treat with the highest level of seriousness. At this stage, it is critical to emphasize one thing clearly. These were allegations and charges, not convictions. In the U.S. legal system, charges represent accusations that must be tested through due process, evidence, and court proceedings. Still, the presence of those allegations significantly changed public perception of the case and reframed it from a bond violation issue into something far more complex and concerning. And this wasn't the first time Prokop's name had appeared in legal documents. Several years earlier, his personal life had already intersected with the court system in a very different context, one involving a well-known television actress and a restraining order, issued for personal safety reasons. At the time, a judge ordered strict separation, underscoring concerns raised during that period. Taken together, these events paint a picture not of a single moment gone wrong, but of a pattern that authorities believed required intervention. What makes this case especially difficult to discuss is the intersection of public recognition and private legal processes. When someone is known for family-oriented entertainment, any serious allegation carries additional emotional weight. Not because of celebrity status, but because of the expectations attached to it. And yet, the legal system operates independently of those expectations. In official terms, the Christmas Eve arrest was described not as an isolated incident, but as the enforcement of prior court decisions. The outcome of those decisions and the truth of the allegations connected to them would ultimately depend on what happened next, inside courtrooms, not headlines. But one question remained unanswered at the time. How did a former child actor's life shift so far away from the structured environment that once defined it? And what warning signs, if any, were visible before things reached this point? That's where the story becomes less about a single arrest and more about the long, often overlooked aftermath of early fame. When stories like this surface, it's tempting to focus only on the moment authorities step in. But according to experts who study former child performers, those moments are often the end of a much longer process, not the beginning. Publicly available information shows that Prokop's acting career slowed significantly after his early success. Unlike some former Disney stars who transitioned into adult roles or maintained a public presence, he largely disappeared from mainstream media coverage. There were no major comeback announcements, no high-profile projects, just long stretches of silence. And silence in cases like this can be misleading, because away from cameras, real life continues, including legal responsibilities, personal relationships, and court oversight when applicable. In Prokop's case, court records referenced by media outlets suggest that legal supervision was already part of his life prior to the Christmas Eve incident. That matters, because bond conditions are not casual guidelines. They are structured rules imposed by a judge designed to manage risk and ensure compliance while a case is pending. Violating those conditions, even without new allegations, can trigger immediate consequences. This is where many people misunderstand situations like this. An arrest for violating bond conditions does not necessarily mean a new crime occurred at that moment. Instead, it means authorities believe previously agreed upon terms were not followed. According to the incident report, officers arrived specifically because of such a concern, not because of a random complaint or public disturbance. Still, the interaction escalated. Reports state that officers described resistance in the form of refusal to comply with instructions. Again, no sensational language is used in official documentation, just procedural descriptions of actions that delayed the arrest. But then came the part of the report that shifted the narrative entirely. During processing, law enforcement documented additional allegations involving unauthorized recording and illegal visual material. These claims, according to authorities, were serious enough to warrant separate charges. At this point, it's important to slow down. Allegations involving exploitation or illegal material are among the most sensitive categories in the legal system. They are handled with heightened scrutiny, strict evidence standards, and when appropriate, immediate protective measures. They are also subject to intense public reaction, even before facts are fully examined in court. That reaction can blur an important distinction. Charges are not verdicts. The justice system requires time, investigation, and due process. While law enforcement may believe they have sufficient grounds to file charges, the ultimate determination belongs to the courts. Still, the presence of those allegations raised questions far beyond a single arrest. How long had investigators been aware of this material? Was it connected to earlier legal issues or uncovered during a separate process? And why did this information only become public after the arrest? Those questions weren't immediately answered, and that uncertainty fueled speculation online. But there was already a precedent for concern. Years earlier, Prokop's relationship with actress Sarah Hyland had ended with a restraining order issued by a judge. According to court documents at the time, the order required complete separation for several years. Judges do not issue such orders lightly. They are typically based on evidence presented in court and concerns for personal safety. While that situation was legally resolved, it remained part of the public record, a reminder that legal intervention had occurred before. When viewed together, these episodes suggest something more complex than a sudden fall from grace. They point to a pattern of escalating legal involvement, with increasing oversight and consequences. And this is where the conversation shifts from one individual to a broader issue. Former child actors often grow up under intense structure, schedules managed by adults, behavior monitored by studios, and public images carefully controlled. When that structure disappears, the transition can be abrupt. Some adjust smoothly, others struggle quietly, without the support systems they once relied on. Experts have noted that early fame can complicate identity development, emotional regulation, and accountability, especially when personal challenges emerge outside the public eye. That doesn't excuse alleged wrongdoing, but it does help explain how situations can develop unnoticed until they reach a critical point. By the time the Christmas Eve arrest occurred, the legal system was already involved. Authorities were not reacting to a rumor or a headline. They were enforcing court decisions already in place, and once that enforcement began, everything else came into focus. What followed would no longer be handled privately. Court filings, booking records, and official statements turned a largely unseen situation into a public one, instantly and permanently. But the most important phase of this story was still ahead, because arrests and charges are only the opening chapter of the legal process, not its conclusion. The real questions were yet to be answered. What evidence would be presented? How would the court interpret it? And what consequences, if any, would follow? Those answers wouldn't come from social media reactions or breaking news, headlines. They would come from legal proceedings, slowly and deliberately. And that's where the story truly moves next. Once the initial reports were published, the public conversation shifted almost immediately, but not always in a constructive direction. Online, many reactions focused on shock rather than structure. Headlines were skimmed, details were compressed, and context was often lost. But legally speaking, this phase of a case is rarely about spectacle. It's about documentation, verification, and process. After an arrest like this, several things typically happen behind the scenes. First, authorities review the circumstances of the bond violation itself. That alone can carry consequences, regardless of any additional allegations. Judges take compliance seriously because bond conditions exist to protect all parties involved and to ensure that court proceedings can move forward without interference. And second, any additional charges are evaluated independently. Each allegation must meet its own legal threshold. Evidence is reviewed, timelines are established, and prosecutors determine how, or if, a case will proceed. This is not a fast process. Despite how quickly news cycles move, the justice system operates at a different pace. Weeks or even months can pass with little public information released, not because nothing is happening, but because investigations require confidentiality and precision. This gap between public attention and legal reality often creates confusion. People ask, why hasn't there been an update? Why isn't this resolved already? Does silence mean something is being hidden? In most cases, silence simply means procedure. And in Prokop's situation, the silence following the initial arrest reflected exactly that, a transition from public incident to formal legal review. Another important aspect often overlooked is how former public figures experience this phase. Unlike private individuals, their names are already searchable. Past interviews, roles, and relationships are instantly resurfaced and reframed through a new lens. Innocent details from years earlier are reinterpreted, sometimes unfairly, as signs or warnings. This retrospective narrative can be misleading. Human lives are not linear stories written backward. Patterns are easier to see after the fact, but that doesn't mean they were obvious in real time. What can be said based on available records is that the legal system had interacted with Prokop before, and that interaction escalated over time. Each step increased oversight. Each violation reduced flexibility. By the time of the Christmas Eve arrest, the margin for error was likely very small. That's why compliance mattered so much in that moment. According to the incident report, officers did not describe a chaotic or dangerous situation. They described refusal to cooperate with instructions, something that, in legal terms, can compound existing issues, even if no one is harmed. This distinction matters for advertiser safety and responsible storytelling. There's a difference between explaining alleged actions and dramatizing them. The former informs, the latter distorts, and distortion is what often dominates viral coverage. Another layer of complexity is the emotional response tied to childhood fame. Audiences feel a sense of familiarity with former child actors, even if they've never met them. That familiarity creates a stronger reaction when something goes wrong because it clashes with the roles people remember. But courts don't operate on nostalgia. They operate on evidence, statutes, and precedent. In situations involving sensitive allegations, judges and prosecutors are especially careful. Protective measures, restrictions, and evaluations are used to ensure safety while preserving the presumption of innocence until proven otherwise. That balance is difficult and often misunderstood. It's also why public speculation can be harmful, not just to the individual involved, but to the integrity of the process itself. This case, like many others involving former public figures, highlights a broader issue: how quickly narratives form, and how slowly truth is established. Arrests feel definitive, charges sound final. But legally, they are beginnings, not endings. And that brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary question. Why do stories like this capture so much attention only at their breaking point? The answer may lie in what happens before, in the years of quiet struggle, limited support, and diminishing structure that rarely make headlines. When fame arrives early, it often leaves early too. What remains is an adult navigating life with a past that never fully lets go, and a public that remembers a version of them that no longer exists. That doesn't absolve responsibility, but it does complicate the narrative. As this case has moved forward, the focus gradually shifted away from the individual incident and toward broader implications about accountability, due process, and how society engages with stories involving former child stars. And while the legal outcome would ultimately be determined in court, the public conversation raised another issue entirely. What lessons, if any, are being learned? And who is responsible for noticing the warning signs before situations reach this point? Because by the time law enforcement is involved, the opportunity for quiet intervention has already passed. As the public attention slowly faded from headlines, the case itself continued on a very different timeline. Court processes don't follow trending cycles, they follow procedures. Documents are filed, motions are reviewed, and decisions are made step by step, often without cameras, commentary, or immediate answers. And that separation between public reaction and legal reality is one of the most misunderstood parts of stories like this. From the outside, it can feel like everything stops after the arrest. But internally, this is when the system becomes most active. Attorneys prepare responses, judges evaluate conditions, investigators verify claims. Each element is handled independently, even if the public perceives it as one single event. This matters because it reframes the story. Instead of asking, "How did this happen?" the more accurate question becomes, "How did this go unnoticed for so long?" And that question extends beyond one individual. Former child actors often exist in a unique gap, no longer protected by studio systems, but still defined by them in the public imagination. Support networks that once monitored schedules, behavior, and well-being are gone. What replaces them is inconsistent at best. Some former performers build new careers, education paths, or private lives. Others struggle quietly, without the structure they once had and without the anonymity most adults take for granted. In Prokop's case, publicly available information suggests that his life after early fame unfolded mostly out of view. No clear professional direction, no sustained public presence, just fragments, legal documents, brief mentions, and eventually, court involvement. That lack of visibility can be deceptive, because absence from the spotlight does not mean absence of challenges. When legal issues arise during this phase, they tend to escalate faster. Not because of celebrity, but because earlier support systems are no longer in place to intervene early. That's one reason courts rely so heavily on bond conditions and compliance. They function as guardrails designed to prevent situations from worsening while due process unfolds. When those guardrails fail, whether through misunderstanding, resistance, or neglect, consequences follow. And that's exactly what the Christmas Eve arrest represented in official terms. A moment when oversight shifted from conditional trust to enforced control. What makes this particularly sobering is how ordinary that process is. There were no dramatic announcements, no public warnings, no spectacle, just paperwork, officers doing their jobs, and a system responding as designed. Yet because of Prokop's past, that ordinary process became extraordinary in the public eye. This contrast highlights something uncomfortable. We often care more about outcomes than origins. We notice the arrest, but not the years leading up to it. We react to the charge, but not the systems that failed to prevent escalation. We consume the headline, but rarely the context. And context is where understanding lives. This story isn't just about a former Disney star. It's about what happens when early fame ends, accountability begins, and personal struggles intersect with the legal system. Quietly, until they no longer can. As legal proceedings continued, the public was left with limited information by design. That restraint isn't secrecy, It's structure. Sensitive cases require it. But the silence created space for another question to emerge, one that goes beyond guilt or innocence. What responsibility does the entertainment industry have after the spotlight moves on? Because for every former child actor who transitions smoothly, there are others whose difficulties surface later, not in interviews, but in courtrooms. And by the time they do, the conversation has already shifted from prevention to consequence. Which brings us to the final layer of this story. Not what happened, not even what will be decided in court, but what this case reveals about how society processes these moments and what we choose to notice and ignore along the way. By the time cases like this reach the public, most of the critical decisions have already been set in motion, quietly, methodically, and far away from online debates. What remains isn't a headline, but a process, one that weighs evidence, applies the law, and moves forward regardless of public memory or past fame. The outcome, whatever it may be, is determined not by who someone once was on screen, but by facts presented in court. And that distinction matters, because stories involving former child actors often become symbolic. They're treated as cautionary tales, moral failures, or dramatic downfalls. But in reality, they are far more complex, shaped by time, systems, accountability, and decisions made long after the cameras stop rolling. This case doesn't offer easy conclusions. It doesn't neatly explain how early fame affects adulthood. It doesn't provide a single moment where everything went wrong, and it doesn't resolve itself in one arrest or one court filing. What it does offer is a reminder that visibility can fade faster than responsibility, that structure matters, especially when it disappears, and that legal systems exist not to tell stories, but to resolve them. For the public, the most responsible position is not judgment, but understanding the process and recognizing that outcomes take time, context, and care. If there is a lesson here, it's not about celebrity. It's about what happens when early success meets adult accountability without adequate support in between. And that raises a final question worth exploring further. How many similar stories never make headlines? Simply because the names involved aren't recognizable? That's the conversation we'll continue next. In the next video, we'll look at what research and first-hand accounts reveal about life after child stardom, what support systems exist, where they fail, and why some transitions are far more difficult than they appear from the outside. Because the real story doesn't end when the spotlight fades. It begins there.